"Don't look for me," the note said. But by the time Alexander Hayes read it, the front door was already swinging open to a night filled with snow and silence. And somewhere out there, Hannah Brooks was walking away from everything she had quietly given up for him without ever asking for anything in return, the cold biting through her thin coat as her steps slowed against the frozen driveway, each breath turning into a fragile cloud that vanished just as quickly as the life she thought she was building. Only hours earlier she had stood in that same house, listening as Alexander's voice turned sharp and distant, accusing her of things she didn't understand, of motives she never had. And even then she didn't argue, didn't defend herself, because some truths were too heavy to explain to someone who had already decided not to believe. Inside the mansion, the warmth felt empty now, the silence louder than any argument. Alexander stood still for a moment, staring at the letter again, his mind racing through fragments he had ignored. The way Hannah always showed up early and left late. The way she never touched anything that wasn't hers. The way she smiled like she expected nothing from anyone. And suddenly none of it made sense with the version of her he had just pushed away. His chest tightened as something unfamiliar crept in. Something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Real doubt about himself. About the walls he had built so high that even someone like Hannah couldn't get through. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant footsteps fading into the storm. And without thinking, without calculating like he always did, Alexander moved, grabbing his coat and rushing out into the cold, calling her name for the first time not as an order, but as a plea. Hannah, his voice cutting through the night, but swallowed almost instantly by the falling snow. He followed the faint trail she left behind, footprints already softening, disappearing inch by inch, as if the world itself was erasing her from his life. His breath grew heavier, his pace faster, panic rising with every step as he realized how far she might already be, how much he had never really seen her until now. And then his eyes caught something on the ground, a small folded piece of paper she must have dropped, his hands trembling as he picked it up, unfolding it carefully. And as he read the first line, everything inside him shifted, because the truth wasn't what he expected, and the person he thought he knew was someone entirely different. Someone who had been protecting him all along without ever saying a word. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander Hayes felt the terrifying weight of being too late. But he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. Not when her footprints were still barely visible ahead. Not when there was still a chance. Even if it was slipping away with every second into the endless white night. The paper shook in Alexander Hayes's hands as the wind pressed harder against him. The words on it barely steady in the storm. And yet each line felt sharper than anything he had heard in years. I never wanted your world. I only wanted you to be safe. And for a moment he could not move, because nothing about that sentence matched the story he had convinced himself was true. His breath slowed, his mind racing backward through every small moment he had ignored, every quiet sacrifice Hannah Brooks had made without asking for recognition. The nights she stayed late fixing things no one noticed. The mornings she arrived early with that same calm expression, never complaining, never expecting anything in return. And now the realization came crashing in. She had never been after his money, never tried to get close to his power. She had been standing right beside him the whole time, protecting him in ways he had not even questioned. And he had answered that loyalty with doubt, with cold words that pushed her out into the freezing night. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground inch by inch, swallowing her footprints faster now, and Alexander forced himself forward again, each step heavier than the last, calling her name louder, his voice breaking through the storm but still met with nothing, no answer, no sign, only the endless white stretching ahead. And then another memory surfaced, something he had dismissed earlier that day, a phone call. Hannah had taken quietly in the corner, her expression tense but controlled. The way she had glanced at him afterward like she wanted to say something but held back. And suddenly it connected. She had been dealing with something serious, something she chose to carry alone, and he had not even asked, had not even cared enough to listen. His chest tightened again as the weight of that failure settled deeper. Because this was not just a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, a wall he had built after being betrayed years ago, a wall that kept everyone out, including the one person who had never given him a reason to doubt. The wind howled louder, cutting through his coat. But he did not stop, his shoes sinking slightly into the snow as he pushed forward, searching, hoping, fearing that every second was taking her farther away. And then he saw it, a faint outline ahead, something darker against the white. His heart jumped as he moved closer, faster now, almost slipping as he reached the edge of the road where the footprints ended completely, replaced by tire tracks that led away into the distance. His breath caught as he looked around, scanning the empty road, the quiet houses, the still night that gave him no answers, only the echo of what he had lost. And in that silence, the truth became impossible to ignore. Hannah had not just walked away. She had left for good, not out of anger, not out of pride, but because he had given her no reason to stay. His hands clenched at his sides. As the realization settled in deeper than anything before, he had not only misunderstood her, he had pushed away the one person who had chosen him without conditions, and now he stood there alone, the snow continuing to fall, erasing the last traces of her presence, leaving him with nothing but the letter in his hand, and the growing fear that even if he searched every road, every city, every place she could have gone, he might never find her again. And yet something inside him refused to accept that ending, because for the first time, Alexander Hayes was no longer thinking about control or pride or distance. He was thinking about her, about the quiet strength he had overlooked, about the truth he had almost destroyed. And as he looked down at the letter again, he noticed something he had missed before, a final line at the bottom, smaller, almost hidden, and the moment he read it, everything changed once more. The final line at the bottom of the letter was almost hidden beneath a faint smudge, as if Hannah Brooks had hesitated before writing it. And as Alexander Hayes read it again, his pulse quickened. If anything happens tonight, do not trust the call. And suddenly the night felt different, no longer just cold and empty, but filled with something he had completely overlooked, a warning he had been too blind to see. His mind snapped back to that earlier moment when her phone rang, the tension in her voice, the way she stepped outside to answer, and the way she returned quieter than usual, like she had already made a decision she could not explain. And now it all aligned in a way that made his chest tighten with urgency. This was never about betrayal, never about deception. She had been dealing with something serious, something dangerous in a way that did not involve violence but control, pressure, something that forced her to act alone, and he had pushed her away right when she needed him the most. The snow continued to fall around him, but he barely felt it now, his focus sharpening as he replayed every detail he could remember, every glance, every pause, every word she did not say. And then it hit him, the call he received earlier that evening, the one that sounded official, the one that suggested Hannah had been involved in something she should not have been. The voice had been calm, convincing, giving just enough information to make him doubt her without asking questions. And now with the letter in his hand, he understood. That call was exactly what she had warned him about. It was never the truth. It was designed to turn him against her, to isolate her. And he had fallen for it completely. His jaw tightened as frustration and regret collided, not just at himself, but at whoever had orchestrated this quiet manipulation, because they had succeeded in the simplest way possible, by making him lose trust in the one person who had never broken it. The road ahead remained empty, the tire tracks already fading as the storm grew heavier, and for a brief moment doubt crept in again. What if he was already too late? What if she was already gone beyond reach? But then he looked back at the letter, at the way her handwriting softened near the end, and he noticed something else, a small detail that most people would have missed, but not him, not anymore. She had signed it not just with her name, but with a small symbol beside it, a simple mark she used sometimes when she finished cleaning near the pool, something he had seen more than once without ever thinking about it, a small wave drawn beside her name. And suddenly a memory surfaced with clarity, a quiet conversation weeks ago when she mentioned a place she liked to go when things became overwhelming, somewhere near water, somewhere quiet where no one would look for her. He had barely listened at the time, distracted by work. But now that fragment felt like the only direction he had left. His breathing steadied as purpose replaced confusion, because this was not just about finding her anymore. It was about understanding everything he had ignored, about proving that this time he would not let assumptions decide for him. He turned back toward his car, the snow crunching beneath his steps as he moved faster, determination building with each second, The engine roared to life as he gripped the wheel, his mind fixed on that single memory, that one place that might still connect him to her before it was too late. And as he pulled onto the road following the fading tracks into the night, one thought repeated in his mind louder than anything else. This time he would listen before he lost her completely. The road stretched ahead in a blur of white and shadow as Alexander Hayes tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the headlights cutting through the falling snow while his mind held on to one fragile memory. A quiet place near water where Hannah Brooks once said she could finally breathe, and now every second felt like it mattered, every mile like a race against something unseen. The storm made visibility worse, but he did not slow down, because for the first time he was not thinking like a billionaire calculating risk. He was thinking like a man who had almost lost the one person who saw him beyond everything he owned. The silence inside the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the distant echo of her voice in his memory. Soft, careful, always choosing her words like they mattered more than anything. And he remembered how she once stood by the pool after sunset, looking out at the water as if it held answers she could not explain. He had asked her casually why she liked it there, and she had smiled faintly, saying it was the only place where things felt honest, where nothing pretended to be more than it was. And at the time he had not understood, but now those words stayed with him, guiding him forward through the storm. He turned onto a narrow road leading out of the main part of the city, the streetlights becoming fewer, the surroundings quieter, until the noise of everything else faded and only the rhythm of the falling snow remained. His heartbeat matched that rhythm now, steady but urgent, as he scanned every corner, every turn, searching for any sign of her. And then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a small lakeside area partially hidden by trees, a place that looked untouched by the world he came from. No luxury, no noise, just stillness. And something inside him told him this was where she would go. He pulled over quickly, stepping out into the cold without hesitation, the air sharper here, the silence deeper, broken only by the soft movement of water beneath a thin layer of ice. His eyes moved across the area, searching, hoping, and fearing all at once. And then he noticed something near the edge of the lake, a figure standing still, barely moving, her outline framed by the pale reflection of the snow. His breath caught as recognition hit instantly. It was her, Hannah Brooks, exactly where he hoped and feared she would be, standing alone as if the world behind her no longer existed. For a moment he did not move, because seeing her there made everything real in a way he could not ignore. The distance between them felt heavier than any words he had said earlier, but he forced himself forward, each step careful, as if afraid she might disappear again if he moved too quickly. The snow crunched beneath his feet, breaking the silence, and she turned slightly, just enough to know she heard him, but she did not face him fully, as if part of her was still deciding whether to stay or walk away for good. His voice came out lower than before, no longer demanding, no longer certain, just honest. Hannah. And in that single word was everything he had failed to say before, the regret, the realization, the truth he had finally begun to understand. The wind moved gently across the lake, carrying the moment between them, fragile and unfinished, and as she slowly turned to face him, the distance between what they were and what they could still be hung silently in the cold night. Waiting for what would come next, Hannah Brooks turned slowly, the cold air brushing against her face as her eyes met Alexander Hayes for the first time since she walked away. And in that quiet moment, nothing needed to be said for him to see the difference, the distance, the quiet strength she had chosen instead of breaking down. Her expression was calm, but no longer soft in the way he remembered, as if something inside her had shifted into place the moment she decided to leave. He stopped a few feet away, not daring to close the distance without permission, his breath visible in the cold as he searched for the right words. But for once in his life, nothing rehearsed, nothing controlled felt right. So he spoke honestly. I was wrong. The words simple but heavy, carrying more than any explanation he could offer. She did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, not angry, not emotional, just distant in a way that made him realize how much he had lost in a matter of hours. The wind moved gently across the lake, creating a faint ripple beneath the thin ice. And for a moment it felt like the world had paused just for them, giving him one chance to say what he should have said before. That call, It was not real, was it? He added, his voice quieter now, and something in her eyes shifted slightly, not surprise, but recognition that he had finally started to understand. She looked away for a second, toward the water, as if choosing her words carefully the same way she always had. It was never meant for you to know the truth, she said softly, her voice steady but carrying a weight he had never noticed before. That is why I did not tell you. And that sentence hit him harder than anything else, because it meant she had made that choice knowingly, choosing silence not because she did not trust him, but because she thought it was the only way to protect him, and he had answered that silence with doubt, with accusations that pushed her out into the cold. His hands clenched slightly at his sides as he stepped closer, just enough to close part of the distance, but still leaving space between them. You should have told me, he said, but even as the words left his mouth he knew they were not fair, because he had not been someone she could tell, not with the way he reacted, not with the walls he kept up. She shook her head gently, a small movement, but enough to stop that thought. You would not have believed me, she replied, and there was no anger in her tone, only quiet certainty, and that truth settled between them heavier than anything else, because he knew she was right. He would have questioned her, doubted her, looked for proof instead of trusting her, just like he always had with everyone, and that realization made everything clear in a way that words could not fix. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with understanding rather than confusion. He looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she stood strong despite everything, at the quiet resilience he had mistaken for something else, and for the first time he saw her completely, not as someone in his world, but as someone who never needed it. I do not expect you to forgive me, he said finally, his voice steady but low. I just needed you to know that I see it now. She met his gaze again, and for a brief second something softened, not enough to undo what had happened, but enough to show that his words reached her. Even if they could not change her decision, the snow continued to fall around them, gentle but constant, as if marking the time they had left in this moment. And then she took a small step back, not turning away yet, but creating that distance again, a silent sign that something had already been decided long before he arrived. And as he stood there watching her, understanding finally replacing denial, one question remained in his mind, not whether he could fix what he had broken, but whether he still had any place left in her life at all. The space between them felt wider than the frozen lake behind Hannah Brooks as she stood still, her eyes steady but distant, and Alexander Hayes could feel it clearly now. This was no longer about explaining or defending. It was about whether anything remained after everything had already been broken. The snow continued to fall softly, covering the ground around them as if trying to quiet the moment, but nothing about it felt peaceful, not when every second carried the weight of what might be ending. He took a slow breath, forcing himself not to rush forward, not to fill the silence with words that would only make things worse, because for the first time he understood that this was not something he could control, not like business, not like deals. This was something he had to face without certainty, without guarantees. Hannah looked at him again, her expression unchanged but her voice calm when she finally spoke. You understand now, but that does not change what happened. And her words were not harsh. They were simply true, and that truth landed deeper than any anger could have. He nodded slightly, accepting it without argument, because denying it would only prove he had not learned anything at all. I know, he replied quietly, his voice steady but stripped of everything it used to carry. No authority, no distance, just honesty. I cannot undo it. And that admission hung in the air between them, raw and real. She studied him for a moment as if trying to decide whether what she was seeing was real or just another version of the man she thought she knew. And then she looked away again, toward the dark water, her breath slow, controlled, as if she had already made peace with something he was only beginning to understand. I did not leave because of what you said, she continued softly, and that caught him off guard, because it was not what he expected. He took a small step forward, careful not to interrupt, listening in a way he never had before. I left because I realized I do not belong in a place where I have to prove who I am, she added, and those words carried a quiet strength that made everything clear in a way nothing else could. This was not just about one moment, one mistake. It was about something deeper, something that had always been there, The imbalance, the distance, the way she had to remain silent while he made assumptions. And now she had chosen something different, something that did not require her to fight for trust. His chest tightened again. But this time it was not just regret. It was understanding, real understanding of what she had been carrying all along. You should not have had to prove anything, he said, his voice low, and she gave a faint, almost sad smile, not because she disagreed, but because it was too late for that realization to change anything. But I did, she replied gently, and the simplicity of that statement said more than anything else. The snow continued to fall around them, the world quiet and still, as if waiting for what would come next, and Alexander knew this was the moment that mattered more than anything. Not for convincing her, not for fixing things instantly, but for showing her that something had truly changed, not in words, but in the way he chose to respond now. He looked at her, steady and sincere. Then let me be someone who does not make you do that again, he said, and there was no demand in his voice, no expectation, just an offer, honest and uncertain, and for the first time since he arrived, something shifted in her expression, subtle but real, a hesitation, not a step forward, but not a step away either, as if she was considering something she had already decided against. And that small moment held more weight than anything else, because it meant the ending was not as certain as it seemed, not yet, not completely, and as the silence settled between them once more, the question remained, not whether he deserved another chance, but whether she was willing to risk believing in him again. The silence stretched between them, fragile but no longer empty, and Hannah Brooks stood still as if measuring the weight of every word Alexander Hayes had just said, not reacting immediately, not giving him anything he could hold on to too quickly, because for her this was not about a single promise, it was about everything that had led to this moment. The snow continued to fall around them, soft and steady, covering the ground in a quiet layer that seemed to blur the past and the present together. And for a moment it felt like time had slowed just enough for truth to settle where it needed to be. She looked at him again, really looked this time, searching for something beyond the words, something that could not be faked or controlled. And what she saw was different, not perfect, not certain, but real in a way she had not seen before, and that difference made her hesitate, just for a second, before she spoke. You always say the right things when it matters, she said softly, her tone calm but not accusing, just honest, and that statement stopped him, because he knew exactly what she meant. He had always been able to handle situations with words, to adjust, to respond in ways that worked in his favor, but this time he did not try to defend it. He did not try to explain it away. He simply nodded slightly, accepting it. I did, he admitted, his voice steady. But this time I am not trying to fix anything. I am just telling you the truth. And there was something in the way he said it that carried weight, not urgency, not pressure, just clarity. She held his gaze for a moment longer, as if testing that statement against everything she had experienced before, and then she let out a slow breath, the cold air visible as it disappeared into the night. The truth does not always change what someone feels, she replied, and again, there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet understanding of how things worked, how damage did not simply disappear because it was acknowledged, and that was something he had to accept, not challenge. He took a small step closer, careful, measured, respecting the space she had created. I know, he said, and this time there was no hesitation, but I am not asking you to feel something different right now. And that caught her attention, a slight shift in her expression that showed she had not expected that answer. He continued, his voice calm but certain. I am asking for the chance to show you something different over time. And that was the first moment where the direction of everything changed, because it was no longer about convincing her in this instant. It was about something slower, something that required patience, something he had never offered anyone before. The snow settled more heavily now, the edges of the lake becoming softer, quieter, and the world around them seemed to fade further into the background, leaving only this conversation, this fragile possibility that neither of them had fully defined yet. Hannah looked away briefly, her thoughts moving through everything that had happened, everything she had chosen when she walked away, and everything she was now being asked to reconsider, not because he demanded it, but because something about him felt different, and that difference made her pause instead of leaving, and that pause mattered more than anything else. You are asking for something you have never given before, she said finally, turning back to him. And her words were not a rejection, not a refusal, but a recognition of what he was truly offering. He nodded again, this time without hesitation. I know, he replied. That is why it matters. And that answer stayed between them, quiet but powerful, because it showed something she had not seen before, not just regret, but change that was willing to take time, willing to exist without guarantees. And as they stood there in the falling snow, the distance between them no longer felt fixed. It felt uncertain, shifting, like something that could either close slowly or remain exactly where it was depending on what happened next. And for the first time since she walked away, Hannah did not step back again. She simply stood there, considering whether the ending she had chosen was truly final or just the beginning of something she had not expected. The quiet between them no longer felt like an ending but something unresolved, something waiting to be defined. And Hannah Brooks stood there with the snow settling softly on her shoulders, her thoughts moving through everything she had chosen when she walked away and everything that was now being placed back in front of her, not as pressure, but as a possibility she had not expected to face again. Alexander Hayes did not move closer this time, did not try to close the distance any further, because he understood now that every step had to be hers, every decision something she could make without being pulled or persuaded. And that restraint alone said more than anything he could have added. She looked at him again, her eyes searching not for perfection but for consistency, for something that would not disappear the moment things became complicated again. And for a brief moment the world around them felt quieter than before, the wind easing slightly as if even the storm had softened. If I stay, she said slowly, her voice calm, but deliberate. Nothing changes overnight. And that was not a condition, not a negotiation. It was a boundary, clear and necessary, and he accepted it without hesitation. It should not, he replied, his voice steady, because for the first time he was not looking for immediate answers or quick resolutions. He was ready for something slower, something real. She held his gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming that he meant it, and then she added, and I will not explain everything all at once. And again, there was no challenge in her tone, just honesty about what she was willing to give and what she was not. And he nodded, understanding that trust was not something he could demand or expect instantly. You do not have to, he said, and that answer shifted something subtle but important between them, because it removed the pressure she had always felt, the need to prove, to justify, to make herself understood in a way that was never required from him. The snow continued to fall, lighter now, almost gentle, as if marking the quiet change taking place in that moment. Hannah looked down briefly, her breath steady, and then back at him, and there was something different in her expression now, not fully open, not completely certain, but no longer closed either. I am not going back with you tonight, she said, and those words carried weight, not rejection, but independence, a choice to move forward on her own terms. And for a second the old version of him might have resisted, might have insisted, but this time he did not. He simply nodded, accepting it as part of what he had to learn. Then I will not ask you to, he replied, and that response held no disappointment, only respect, and that respect mattered more than anything else in that moment. She watched him carefully, as if expecting something different, something familiar, but when it did not come, when he simply stood there without trying to change her decision, something inside her shifted again, small but real. There is something you still do not know, she said after a pause, her voice quieter now, and his attention sharpened instantly, not with urgency, but with focus, because he understood now that this was not something to interrupt or rush. The reason I left was not just about you, she continued, and that added a new layer to everything, something he had not fully considered yet. He stayed silent, giving her the space to continue, and she glanced briefly toward the dark edge of the trees beyond the lake, as if something out there still mattered, still influenced her decision. The call you received was only part of it, she said, and her tone carried a hint of something unresolved, something that had not ended with her leaving, and that realization settled in slowly. This was not just a past mistake, not just a moment they could move beyond. There was something ongoing, something that still affected her, and by extension, could still affect him. And as he stood there listening, the weight of that truth became clear. This was not just about rebuilding trust. It was about understanding a situation that was far from over, and for the first time since he arrived. The question in his mind shifted again, not whether she would stay, but what exactly she had been protecting him from all along. The air felt heavier after her words, as if the quiet night itself was holding on to the truth she had only just begun to reveal. And Alexander Hayes stood still, not interrupting, not rushing her, because he understood now that whatever she was about to say mattered far beyond his own regret. Hannah Brooks kept her gaze toward the dark line of trees for a moment longer, as if deciding how much she was willing to share. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was calm, but carried a depth he had not fully understood until now. "Someone has been watching you for a long time," she said, and those words settled slowly, not with fear, but with clarity, because this was not about something sudden or chaotic. It was something deliberate, something calculated in a way that made his earlier assumptions seem even more careless. He did not react immediately, did not question her in the way he once would have. Instead, he listened, fully, completely, because this time he knew that understanding her mattered more than defending himself. "They do not approach you directly," she continued, her tone steady. "They influence things around you. People, information, decisions." And as she spoke, the pattern became clearer in his mind. Small inconsistencies he had ignored, deals that shifted unexpectedly, conversations that felt slightly off but never enough to question deeply, and now all of it connected in a way that made sense, not as coincidence, but as intention. He exhaled slowly, absorbing it, realizing that the call he received earlier was just one piece of something much larger, something that had already been in motion long before tonight. "I found out by accident," she added, and there was a quiet honesty in that statement. "And once I understood it, I knew staying close to you would make it easier for them to use me against you." And that was the part that changed everything, because it meant her silence, her distance, even her decision to leave was never about doubt or weakness. It was about protecting him in the only way she believed she could, by removing herself before she became a risk. His chest tightened again, but this time it was not just regret. It was something deeper, respect for the strength it must have taken to make that choice without telling him, without expecting him to understand. "You should have trusted me with that," he said quietly, but his tone was different now, not accusing, just wishing things had been different. She shook her head slightly, a soft but certain motion. "Trust is not only about telling someone the truth," she replied. "Sometimes it is about knowing what they are ready to hear." And that answer stayed with him, because it revealed something he had not considered before. That trust was not just about honesty, but about timing, about whether the other person was capable of understanding without destroying what was being given. The snow had nearly stopped now, the night settling into a stillness that felt almost fragile, as if everything around them was waiting for what would happen next. He looked at her, not as someone who had walked away, but as someone who had carried a burden he never saw. And for the first time he understood that this was not a situation he could solve quickly, not something he could fix with resources or decisions. This required patience, awareness, and most of all, a different way of being than he had ever practiced before. "Then let me be ready now," he said, his voice steady but sincere, and she met his gaze again. And this time there was something undeniably different, not certainty, not forgiveness, but the beginning of something that had not existed before, a possibility built on truth instead of assumption. She did not answer immediately, and she did not step closer, but she did not step away either. And in that quiet space between them, the future remained unwritten, not defined by what had already happened, but by what they would choose to do next, together or apart. And as the first light hint of dawn began to touch the horizon beyond the lake, the question was no longer whether he had lost her, but whether he could become someone worthy of finding her again.